our final category of informal fallacies get grouped under the heading of fallacies of grammatical analogy. There are also sometimes called fallacies of transference. These fallacies also were identified by Aristotle, though he conceived of them as primarily linguistic, whereas nowadays we think of them as more physical or material kinds of mistakes. In general, in fallacies of grammatical analogy, the difference between a good version of the argument and a bad version of the argument all turns on whether or not a premise, which is usually implicit in the argument, is true for the case at hand or fails to be true for the case at hand. So these arguments are either sound arguments or unsound arguments. The unsound arguments are the ones that are informal fallacies, and they're more seductive to us because that implicit premise doesn't get stated. It's not easy to notice. These arguments work many times, so when they fail, oftentimes we don't consider whether or not that implicit premise is true or not. So those implicit premises, they assert a relationship between the parts of a thing and the whole, between individual members and a class. And those assumptions aren't universally true. So let's take a look at an example of that. So if your cat, when you came home, said to you, I'm composed of molecules, molecules are composed of atoms, hence I'm composed of atoms. Well, the first thing you ought to do probably is consult a mental health professional, because cats don't actually talk. But, all right, you would also might want to respond by good kitty. That's a perfectly legitimate argument. Right? You are, in fact, composed of molecules. Molecules are, in fact, composed of atoms. Since molecules have that property of being composed of atoms, you also have that property of being composed of atoms. So that implicit premise that your parts and their properties are also properties that you have as a whole is true in this case, and the argument is perfectly fine. However, if your cat were to say something like this, I hate cat food, I am what I eat, hence in order to avoid hating myself, I must avoid eating cat food, which is probably what most of my cats would have said could they talk. You'd probably say bad kitty, or you should anyway, because in this case, right, the properties, the things that we consume, aren't properties of us just because we consume them, because they become part of us. So if I eat, I don't know, a hamburger, I don't become a cow. Now, these fallacies can oftentimes be confused with fallacies from other parts of our lecture and our text. So we'll want to be able to find a way to distinguish between them. And the way to distinguish between them is the nature of their predication. That is, they say something, but what did they say it about? And so this distinction between distributive versus collective predication is useful for understanding these fallacies and the relationship to similar-looking fallacies elsewhere. One way to illustrate this is to sort of think about the different attitudes between spring breakers and college administrators about beer. Right? So college administrators think, oh, beer is abused, especially during spring break. Well, they're not talking about each and every individual beer. Right? They're talking about beer as a stuff. So they're making a collective predication. They're talking about the class, and the class as a class of things is a class where that class of things tends to be abused. So a collective predication, it describes something about the whole. On the other hand, those spring breakers, they probably are thinking in terms of a distributive predication. They've never met a beer they didn't love, as it were. So when they say beer is good, they're probably talking about each and every beer they've ever run across. All right? So they're making a distributive predication. They're saying that this property is good, right, applies to every single member of the class. So the predication gets distributed throughout the entire class. Every individual gets that same property here. So collective predications about classes, distributive predications about individual members of those classes. And we can sort of see now how we can use that distinction between collective and distributed predications to understand the difference between, on the one hand, our fallacy of composition, and on the other hand, hasty generalization. So both of these arguments start off by talking about particular facts of particular individual things. However, when we look at what they derive, their conclusions, right, as they go from those particular facts to their general statements, hasty generalization ends with a universal generalization, a distributive predication. This crow is black, this crow is black, this crow is black, all crows are black. Every individual crow has that property of being black, distributed predication. Or on the other hand, fallacy of composition, right? It goes from observations about particular members of a whole or a class to a collective predication, a statement about the whole class, which isn't distributed. Right? So, for example, right, when I say that every brick in this building was made by the same company, it doesn't follow that the building itself was made by that same company. Okay? Properties of the parts not necessarily had by the wholes. The conclusion there is a collective predication with our fallacy of composition. Our other fallacy of grammatical analogy or illicit transference is the fallacy of division. So, for instance, if you came home and your cat said, I have mass, I'm just a collection of cells, hence each of my cells has a mass. You're going from observations about you as a collection, as a whole, right? Here's a property that I have as a whole, therefore each of my individual parts must have that property as well. Now, this particular case, perfectly good inference. That transference isn't illicit. Anything that has mass is composed of things that also have mass. Mass does transfer. So you might say, oh, good kitty. However, if your cat said something like this, I have a mind, I'm just a collection of cells, hence each of my cells has a mind, that is a fallacy of division. Right? So a property that you have as an organism with a central nervous system and so on isn't obviously a property that's had by the individual members of your body, the collection out of which you are composed. So, your toenails aren't likely candidates for mentality just because they are cells in your body. That doesn't mean that if you smash your toe, you're killing sentient beings and so on. So, fallacy of division and an illicit transference, right, from a property had by a whole or a composite or a collective to each of the individual elements or members of that whole, composite, or collective. Again, these are usually implicitly assumed, these relationships. This property is had by the whole, hence it must be had by the parts. And we can distinguish between fallacy of accident and fallacy of division, again, drawing on that distinction between collective and distributed predications. So each of them go from a general statement to a particular statement, but the character of the general statement is different from the fallacy of accident to the fallacy of division. So when we think about a general statement in the fallacy of accident, it's a universal generalization. It says something that is distributed. It says something about each and every member of that class. In the case of fallacy of division, we're starting off with a statement about the class. We're making a collective predication. So I have a mind. My car works. That painting is beautiful. These are all statements about a whole. They're collective predications. Whereas all crows are black, all sunny days are lovely, and so on. These are distributed predications. Fallacy of accident, therefore, goes from a distributed predication to a statement about a particular fact, namely some instance, some case follows the generalization. Fallacy of division goes from that property had by the whole of the collection to say that each of the individual parts has that property. And of course, if a picture is beautiful, that doesn't mean that every component of the picture in and of itself is beautiful. The wood or the canvas on the backside isn't necessarily beautiful. So we can distinguish between fallacy of accident and fallacy of division using that distinction between distributive and collective predications.